I was with Swamiji in some informal circumstance. I can't remember where or why. It was just in his dining room. And he referred to the story of the life of Christ as the greatest story ever told, which is how movies have been titled and so on. And when he said that, it's the greatest story ever told, I sort of, without thinking, just said, really, Swami? Like the greatest story ever? But I'll never forget this look that came over his face. And he just looked at me and he said, don't you think it is? And all of a sudden, all my intellectuality and, useless verbiage just fell away in the divine wonder that was in his voice and on his face when he said that. And one of the characteristics that we talk about of true spirituality is to be childlike. And it's a childlike reality that's a little hard sometimes for us to find, because it's the farthest thing from the naivete of a child or the irresponsible immaturity of a child. We sometimes think that to be childlike is to be a little disconnected from reality and a little irresponsible and sort of that way of doing it. What we have to come to understand is the childlikeness of a saint is the freedom that comes from understanding from a level that we can only pray to understand. That what is happening on this planet is so very, very different than what we think it is. We spend a tremendous amount of our time being anxious about all these lesser realities and very concerned about our particular role. The idea, what about me? Where do I fit? Even for generous-hearted, confident people, there's always a piece of that identifies with this entity as a separate entity and therefore is always standing in relationship, is always being responded to, is always reacting. And as long as the pronoun I has an edge to it, then we are always slightly at war with the world. It's just impossible not to be. We move through and we bump into. People bump into us. When I met Swami Kriyananda for the first time, when I saw him for the first time, which was November of 1969, just barely 2 or 3 miles from here, at a tent set up behind the Beta Chi fraternity house at Stanford. It was the 60s and somebody thought it'd be fun to have a Swami. It was a very unfocused, rather chaotic gathering in this tent with these bleachers and a few people from Ananda, Lakshmi, Satya, Binay, some of you know their names, probably Jaya. I don't know if Jyotish was there, but I presume he was. They were all sitting in the front row dressed in white, and they were meditating like this. And all the rest of us were just it was chaos. But I was sitting way back there, and Swami walked in. And I was already aware of self-realization, I would say as the goal of life. But I was very vague on what that really meant. And he walked in. I'd never seen him before. I had been told by my friend Lakshmi that he's a real teacher, she said, and I think you'll like him. And he walked in, and what I saw and how I perceived it, I don't know, that his consciousness had no boundary. And I'd never thought about it before. But everybody I'd always looked at, and certainly myself, I existed within the boundaries. And he walked in, his aura immediately filled the tent and then just kept going. And when he spoke, I was about as far away from him as you could still be and still be under the canvas. And I sort of, the people I was with insisted on the distance, otherwise I would have been with Lakshmi in the front row. But they insisted on the distance. But when he began to talk, he was right there. I mean, even when I think about it now, how long ago is this? You know, it's approaching 50 years. He was right there. I could still see him. Of course, I was looking at him there, but he was right here because there was no distance. So we come then to this story about Jesus. Jesus knows everything that's going to happen. He's been hinting to his disciples. He's come in this glorious, this wave of glory on Palm Sunday, but he knows. It's Palm Sunday. That's Sunday, today is Friday. He knows that within a matter of this much time, he will be arrested and then he will be killed. And he's warning his disciples. He's telling them. I'm sure in retrospect they understood more of what he was saying than they did in the moment. Swamiji said in the last days of Master's life, Master put a veil over their awareness. So they sort of knew, but they really didn't know. I mean, what would it have been like to go to the banquet and know that this was in, half an hour or an hour after they arrived, it would be over? How could Swami have just sat there taking notes? You'd throw yourself at his feet and hold on to his ankles and plead with him not to go. I mean, it would just be the way you would respond. So Jesus gathers his disciples for the Last Supper and he talks to them. He warns Peter that he's going to repudiate him before the dawn comes. And then he takes his disciples off to the Garden of Gethsemane. These are places they would always go. There was nothing unusual about any of this. They would have their meal together. They would go off to this more hidden place where they could be alone and they could pray. All of this is ordinary. But meanwhile, Jesus knows that Judas is here. Even at the Last Supper, he says, one of you will betray me. And the disciples are sitting there and Jesus says, one will betray me. And they say, who is that? Who's that? And then they speak to John. It's so human. They speak to John, who had a more intimate relationship with Jesus, seemingly, than some of the others. And they said, you ask him, like this. We can't, but you ask him. So John quietly says to Jesus, who? And apparently Jesus will answer John, that who dips my bread when I dip it, or the one to whom I give the bread, depending on which gospel. And so it happens just as he says. And then Jesus just says to Judas, that which you are about to do, do quickly. And the disciples all think he's sending him out on an errand because Judas immediately gets up and goes away. Afterwards, everybody sees it. But also, there's so many things. Judas was one of the chosen. Judas was Jesus' true disciple. Judas was a very advanced soul, but delusion had entered into him. Satan had entered into him. But before he was lost, Judas was lost completely to that dark force. Jesus wanted him to know, I am with you. He didn't even say, don't do it. He said, that which you are about to do, go ahead and do it. And just like Jesus warned Peter that, because Peter had said heroically to Jesus, because Jesus had said, I'm going to a place where you can't follow me. And Peter, who was very dramatic apparently, he picked up his sword and cut off the ear. He said, what do you mean, Lord? I will go everywhere with you. There's no place I won't follow you. Jesus says, really? Or words to that effect. He says, before the dawn comes and the cock crows, you will deny that you have even known me 3 times. Even with those words, Peter was so frightened. Now, Jesus knew all of this, and here's the other part of it that's so, there's a place in Israel It's called, they say it in French, and I can't say it in French, but it's the Church of the Three Chickens, is what it's called, because it's the place where Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. It's really, and they have underground, like prison cells, and it's believed that that was where Jesus was taken, and then he was held in these way underground in these cells. Very, very powerful. And when you get way underground, you feel the absolute aloneness of what Jesus was holding. Now, of course, I feel it in the boundaries of my consciousness, but Jesus was equally in everyone. And a master comes for many reasons. An avatar comes for many reasons. An avatar especially comes because he has a mission to turn all of society. And of course, to turn all of society does not happen in the span of one short lifetime. To turn society, causal, astral, then material, this tremendous force has to start before it finally manifests like this. So Jesus came to create this revolution, to break this idea that we must fear the Lord. Because this was what the priests at that time, the people who were holding the one true faith, which was Judaism at that time. By one true faith, I mean true to the principles of Sanatan Dharma, not sectarian. But Judaism is Sanatan Dharma, but it had twisted in the hands of a corrupt priesthood. And now God was the judge, and he was rigid in his judgment, and if the rules were not followed, then the curse be upon you. And Jesus came to say, if you ask of your Father a loaf of bread, will he give you a stone? And he wanted to bring people back to the loving reality of God instead of this fearsome image that had corrupted. He wanted to bring people back to the kingdom of heaven is within. He wanted to bring people back to the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You know, all of these different essential points, but he couldn't just move everyone like that. He could only set this power in motion. And part of what would make that mission possible was if his disciples were able to receive his power and stand as he was able to stand. So the Guru incarnates to make the mission possible, but he's drawn or brings with him those disciples whose destiny it is to also make it happen, and who need from the Master the power and the courage to do that. The Master is completely free, but he's bound by the remaining karma of his disciples. And his mission is defined by them. So Swamiji pointed out, among other things, that the entire story, which is true, that Jesus died on the cross and in doing so expurgated the sins of mankind. There's tremendous spiritual truth in that, because the Guru can lift from the disciples, lift karma from the disciples, simply remove it. And his physical body is a tremendous vehicle for that transformation. In Master's life, at the end of his life, he suffered many different physical ailments. And he talked, particularly when his knees were troubled, he spoke of astral demons pounding on his knees with chisels and things like this, trying to cause a great pain. And he said, and it was known, he was just working out on his own body the karma of his disciples. So that by his, it's a strong man taking a blow. That the karmic force must be expended somewhere, but that which might kill a weaker person, a strong one simply absorbs. And then by the karmic law, who knows? Master himself in autobiography simply says advanced yogis can use their bodies to work out the karma of others. He tells us how to regenerate an amputated limb by the power of will. But about working out the karma of other people in your own body, he just says it can be done. I think it's too sacred. When Swami Kriyananda said to me, when Ananda Assisi was attacked and 9 of our people, I believe, or 7 or 9 of them were actually taken off to prison on this completely trumped up case, but it was a criminal case and they were taken to prison. And Swamiji was in India, not in Italy. He was meant to be arrested, but he was in India. And he was too ill to travel. He just simply couldn't travel. So he was desperate to come back because he couldn't bear that they were being afflicted when he felt as the leader it was his responsibility. But also he said if he was arrested, he said, everybody's energy would be concerned about him being arrested and they wouldn't get anything else done. But while he was in India, then while they were in prison, he fell in the bathroom. There was a shower in his bathroom, and it was on a floor level, and it had a tile lip, about 3 inches high and about 4 inches wide. And he fell with just like a dead weight right in the middle of his back, right over that, like this. And I was talking to him on the phone. It was very interesting because at the time, people said to him, you slipped in the bathroom. And he kept saying, no, I fell. I didn't slip, I fell. And it was such an odd, he kept insisting on it. But he wanted us to know it wasn't an ordinary accident. And when I was talking to him on the phone, he said to me, I was in the bathroom and I fell. He said, it's a terrible pain in my back. I hope it helps with the situation in Assisi. Later, when I wrote the book, Swami Kriyananda as We Have Known Him, I put that in a chapter. And Swami said, he read every word of that book, and he made very few suggestions. But he said, you can't print that. And I, for some reason, was very feisty. But it's what you said, Swamiji. He said, I'm sorry, you can't print that. I said, you told me it's the whole point of the whole story. He said, you can't print that. And it was an impasse. And I was staying in his house, and I went to sleep that night. I was sleeping in this tent on the roof. And I woke up about 4 a.m. with an idea of how I could rewrite the story. He came in at 5, into my room at 5, to say, you can't print that. I said, it's all right, I've worked it out. He said, even if I said it, he said, it's not for me to say. And that wasn't just humility, really. It was simply, this is too sacred. This is not something that you just broadcast in this way. Now that he's passed, I feel I have his permission to say it. And because it's true. And Jesus there, in the same way, he took upon his physical body, just like the Christians say, he took on his physical body the karma of his disciples. And shortly after, this is how Swami explains it, came the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit descended on all the disciples and they were lifted up. And then they were able to carry on. So Jesus himself, he's living on all these levels simultaneously. He's living on the level where he sees what's happening. He sees the grief of his disciples. He sees the terrible challenge this is going to be for them. How Judas, in fact, is going to kill himself. Because he does. Judas didn't think that Jesus would just give up. Judas was trying to push Jesus into declaring himself with power. And instead, when Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, Judas, who was a true disciple, became distraught and immediately went and hung himself. I mean, what a nightmare for everyone. And here's Peter, whom everyone is depending on, who has 3 times said, I don't even know him. But Jesus has taken all of this into himself with tremendous confidence that his disciples will walk through on the other side into glory. And he knows also that after the darkness, the resurrection will come. And just hearing these biblical words, people who are dedicated to Jesus just read the Bible over and over again. And, I like to read lots of different things. But every so often, when you really hear the Bible, you think, I don't need anything else. If I just read this story over and over again, because isn't it, after all, the greatest story ever told?